The Goonies, a Richard Donner film.
Gotcha! Now get out from behind her. You're ruining the painting.
Data.
Body painter!
Call themselves the Goonies.
What happened to the kids who once looked untouchable in one of the most beloved adventure movies of the 1980s? Behind the treasure maps, bike chases, and childhood magic, the real stories turned out far messier, darker, and far more unbelievable than fans ever imagined. Ke Huy Quan, the brilliant kid audiences adored, vanished from Hollywood so completely that it seemed like his story was over, until he came back and stunned the industry in one of the most unbelievable comebacks of our time. Corey Feldman went the other way, from one of the most recognizable faces of his generation to years of pain, controversy, and very public struggles that changed how people saw him forever. So behind the adventure, the laughter, and that childhood magic, how did time hit this cast in such completely different ways? Let's take a look back at how the cast of the Goonies changed over 41 years. Number 1. Josh Brolin, the Goonies' big brother turned Hollywood giant. Back in the Goonies, Josh Brolin looked exactly like the kind of kid Hollywood should have turned into a forever golden prince. As Brand Walsh, he had that classic big brother energy, protective, a little cocky, athletic, and cool enough to stand out from the rest of the group. He was not the dreamer like Mikey, and he was not the chaotic troublemaker like Mouth. He was the grounded one, the kind of character who felt rooted in real life while still fitting naturally into the adventure. For a lot of viewers, that is still the image that remains, the handsome older brother in one of the most beloved adventure movies of the 1980s, standing right on the edge of what should have been a smooth, easy rise to stardom. But the truth is, after that big debut, he did not move straight into his peak years. What followed was a long stretch of struggle, with a career that never fully took off and a private life that kept getting darker, heavier, and harder to control. The Goonies brought him into the light, but that light was not enough to protect him from a very chaotic chapter of his life. What pulled Josh Brolin downward was not one single fall, but an entire self-destructive way of living that went on for years. He got into drugs early, sank deep into alcohol, and lived inside cycles of impulsiveness, anger, and loss of control. There was a period when he was in and out of jail repeatedly. In recent interviews tied to his memoir, the number mentioned was 9 times. In 2004, he was arrested after an incident involving allegations of domestic violence with Diane Lane, who was his wife at the time. The case resulted in a spousal battery charge before Lane declined to pursue it. In the years that followed, he no longer looked like the older brother from a childhood classic. He looked like a man surrounded by the noise of drinking, fights, and one crossed line after another. What makes that period so disturbing is that it did not unfold like one explosive scandal and then disappear. It felt more like a long downward slide where he kept repeating the same pattern of self-destruction over and over again. And what makes his story so haunting is that it was never just about fame followed by a fall. It was the story of someone worn down by chaos for so long that the future started to narrow into only 2 terrible possibilities: an early death or prison. Based on interviews and excerpts from his memoir, Brolin's childhood was already marked by instability, from a deeply messy family environment to being exposed to drugs and alcohol far too early. When fame arrived, it did not save the parts of him that were already breaking. If anything, it made the collapse more dangerous because people were no longer looking at a young man full of promise. They were watching someone slowly drift farther and farther away from himself. But Josh Brolin did not end there. In 2013, everything changed after he hit bottom following a drunken night. And from that point on, he began the sober chapter that has lasted to this day. What makes his comeback so remarkable is that it was never built on nostalgia for the Goonies. He did not return as a former child star people simply remembered with affection. He came back as a fully formed adult actor, carrying a depth, a weariness, and a weight that his younger self never had. No Country for Old Men became the turning point. And after that came W, Milk, Sicario, the iconic role of Thanos in the Marvel Universe, and Dune. The big brother who once seemed like he might be swallowed by his own past eventually rose into one of the most powerful screen presences in modern Hollywood. And maybe that is the greatest contrast in Josh Brolin's story now. From a man who once seemed to be slowly losing himself, he returned with a stature far greater than the glow of his early youth ever promised. Number 2. Ke Huy Quan, the forgotten child star who came back and won Hollywood's heart back in the Goonies. Ke Huy Quan looked exactly like the kind of child star Hollywood should have held on to forever. As Data, he was quick, funny, inventive, and almost impossible to forget. The kid with all the crazy gadgets, explosive energy, and the kind of screen presence that made it feel like his future had already been written. He never felt like a side character. He felt like one of those rare child actors who could steal an entire movie just by showing up on screen. And that is exactly why what happened next feels even more shocking. Instead of moving on to bigger and bigger roles, Kwan's acting career almost disappeared. In his early 20s, he stepped away from acting because there were simply too few meaningful roles for Asian actors. The boy audiences remembered so clearly was suddenly pushed to the margins of the industry, not because people had forgotten his talent, but because Hollywood no longer had room for it. For years, he did not live the life people once imagined for him. He worked behind the camera as a stunt coordinator and assistant director, including a period working with Wong Kar-wai, while the version of Ke Huy Quan most people remembered stayed frozen in the 1980s. And that is exactly why his return hit Hollywood so hard. Ke Huy Quan did not come back after a short break. He came back after nearly 2 decades away, in an industry that had already moved on without him, and somehow turned that silence into one of the most emotional comebacks of the modern era. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once changed everything. The same actor who had once seemed like a forgotten piece of 1980s nostalgia suddenly became the emotional heart of a film that swept through awards season, then went on to win the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor in 2023. And from there, the comeback only grew bigger. Major new roles: Loki, American-born Chinese, his first leading film role in Love Hurts, and a kind of love from audiences that ran far deeper than ordinary fame. Hollywood did not just welcome him back, it seemed to fall in love with him all over again. And that is what makes Ke Huy Quan's story feel both moving and almost unbelievable. He went from being a child star people thought had disappeared for good to becoming one of the most celebrated comeback stories in the entire film industry. Time did not just change him. It turned a once-forgotten little boy into the man who came back and won everyone's heart. Number 3. Corey Feldman, the beloved 80s rebel whose fame slowly turned into pain. Back in the 1980s, Corey Feldman did not just look like a famous star. He looked untouchable. In the Goonies, he brought mouth to life with that rebellious, fast-talking, sly energy that made the character instantly unforgettable. And that film was only one part of a much bigger run of success. Around the same time, he was everywhere, from Stand By Me to The Lost Boys and one youth-driven hit after another, until his face no longer felt like the face of just another child actor, but almost like part of the decade itself. He had edge, personality, and the kind of star power that made people think it would never fade. And that is exactly why the contrast feels so cruel now. Corey Feldman was never supposed to become one of the saddest cautionary tales of that generation. He was supposed to grow up with the spotlight still following him. But not long after all that fame, his name started slipping off the screen and landing on front pages instead. The headlines were no longer about new movies or teen stardom. They were about heroin, cocaine, arrests, rehab, and a life that kept spinning further out of control. His downfall did not happen in one explosive moment. It happened slowly, painfully, like piece by piece, the image of that child star breaking apart right in front of the public. The kid who had once seemed sharp, fearless, and impossible to knock down gradually became one of the saddest examples of the dark side of early fame. And what made the story even heavier was that it did not stop with addiction. For years, Feldman kept speaking publicly about the abuse he says he endured as a child actor, which brought wave after wave of controversy, doubt, ridicule, and cold reactions from the very industry that had once raised him up. For a time, people no longer saw him as the beloved rebel kid. They saw him as a troubled former child star, unstable, controversial, and far too easy to dismiss. At 54, he is still out there. He still appears in public, still tours with his former castmates for Stand By Me anniversary events, and still lives very close to the 1980s legacy that made him famous. But the image he carries now is nothing like the bright, rebellious boy people once remembered. He has become a far more worn, controversial, and visibly tired figure after so many years spent living inside old fame and controversies that never fully went away. Even in late 2025, he was still making headlines after publicly calling the behind-the-scenes environment on Dancing with the Stars toxic. In other words, Corey Feldman is still here, and he is still remembered, but not as some triumphant comeback story. He feels more like a living reminder of the real price of becoming famous too young. Number 4. Jeff Cohen, the funny kid who vanished and reinvented himself. Back in the Goonies, Jeff Cohen was the funny kid audiences could barely forget. As Chunk, he brought that loud, awkward, lovable energy that made him instantly memorable the moment he showed up on screen. But in a way, that was also almost the last image the public ever held of him as an actor. Unlike a lot of child stars who faded gradually, Jeff Cohen seemed to disappear from Hollywood while he was still very young, to the point that it almost felt like the industry had completely forgotten a kid who had once stood out so much, all because puberty closed a door he could not reopen. But what makes Jeff Cohen's story interesting is not that he disappeared. It is the way he came back. He did not try to hold on to acting, and he did not spend the rest of his life living off old memories. Instead, he stepped away from the camera entirely, went to law school, reinvented himself as a successful entertainment lawyer, and eventually became a co-founder of Cohen Gardner. The kid Hollywood stopped casting ended up coming back as someone with a voice inside that very same industry, no longer the child waiting for other people to hand him an opportunity, but the man sitting on the other side of the negotiating table. What makes that transformation even stronger is that Jeff Cohen did not just come back in a completely different profession. He came back in a way that carried real influence. Years later, he was the one who negotiated the deal that helped Ke Huy Quan land Everything Everywhere All at Once, the film that launched one of the most beautiful comebacks in modern Hollywood. In other words, Chunk did not return as an actor. He returned as someone who helped make someone else's comeback possible. The funny kid who once seemed left behind by the screen never really disappeared from Hollywood at all. He just came back in a position almost nobody could have expected, calmer, more powerful, and in a way that feels even more impressive than a typical comeback story. Number 5. Sean Astin, the Goonies dreamer who stood the test of time. As Mikey, he was the dreamer, the kid who still believed there was always something bigger waiting just beyond ordinary life, and that is exactly how audiences remembered him for years afterward. He had that gentle, hopeful energy that made him feel like more than just a child star. He felt like the emotional center of an entire piece of childhood for generations of viewers. But what makes Sean Astin's story stand out today is that time never broke him the way it broke so many others around him. It changed him, but it never erased him. Instead of fading out or disappearing, Astin quietly grew into one of Hollywood's most enduring faces, the kind of understated hero who may not be flashy, but stays with audiences for a very long time. From Mikey, he moved on to Rudy, then Samwise Gamgee in The Lord of the Rings, one of the most beloved portrayals of loyalty in the 2000s, and later reached an entirely new generation through Netflix's smash hit, Stranger Things. Decades after The Goonies, he still was not living off a single childhood role. And by 2025, that steady journey had led to something even more surprising. Sean Astin was elected president of SAG-AFTRA, one of the most respected leadership positions in the industry. And maybe that is the real contrast in his story. The boy who once chased pirate treasure grew up into something even rarer than a Hollywood comeback, someone who truly stood the test of time. Number 6. Carrie Green, the radiant 80s starlet, who quietly slipped away from the spotlight. Back in the Goonies, Carrie Green had exactly the kind of glow 1980s Hollywood loved. As Andy, she had warmth, charm, and a radiance that made people almost assume she was destined to go much further. After that film, she went on to appear in Lucas and 3 for the Road, and everything about that moment made it feel like this was only the beginning of a much bigger journey. But the most surprising part was not that she stumbled, it was that she slowly disappeared in a way almost no one even noticed at first. There was no loud scandal, no major tragedy dramatic enough to keep her in the headlines. The spotlight that once seemed to fit her so perfectly just started drifting away, and Carrie Green quietly stepped out of the orbit people had always assumed she belonged in. In an industry where people are used to watching very public falls, Carrie Green's disappearance happened so softly, it almost hurt more. She stepped away from acting, moved into writing and directing, and chose a far more private rhythm of life than the one the public once imagined for her. So while many of her former castmates went through chaos, scandals, or loud comebacks, Carrie Green was preserved by time in a different way, as one of those bright faces forever frozen in 1980s memory, and as a reminder that sometimes what leaves Hollywood is not a star that burned out, but a light that simply chose to step away from the stage. Number 7. Joe Pantoliano, the tough guy life hit harder off screen. Back in the Goonies, Joe Pantoliano was not the kind of face meant to be loved. He entered the movie like an off-kilter, unpredictable, slightly dangerous force, and just a few scenes were enough to make him unforgettable. For years after that, he almost perfectly locked in the image of a hard-edged, fast-talking guy who looked like trouble the moment he showed up, from The Matrix to The Sopranos. But the darkest part of Joe Pantoliano's story was never on screen. In real life, he went through a deeply chaotic period marked by undiagnosed clinical depression, then tried to medicate it with alcohol, drugs, and reckless behavior, to the point that even his family life was nearly pushed to the breaking point. Today, Joe Pantoliano is 73, and his image has changed a great deal. He is still acting, with recent projects like The Last of Us, Holiday Touchdown, A Bill's Love Story, and even a cameo in Wonder Man. But what stands out more is that he no longer hides that dark chapter of his life. Instead, he has turned it into part of his public voice on mental health while continuing to support his organization, No Kidding? Me Too, to raise awareness around mental illness. In other words, Joe Pantoliano is still a very familiar face in Hollywood, but he is no longer just the tough guy people remember from years ago. He feels more like a man who went through the darkest part of his life, survived it, and came back carrying a depth heavier than any role he ever played. Number 8. John Matuszak, the gentle giant behind Sloth, whose life ended far too soon. Back in the Goonies, John Matuszak gave audiences one of the film's most unforgettable surprises. Under all the heavy makeup and the frightening first impression, Sloth slowly became something else entirely. Not a monster, but a gentle soul, a wounded outsider, and finally one of the movie's biggest emotional payoffs. On screen, Sloth turned into a symbol of warmth, loyalty, and unexpected heart. Off screen, the man behind him was carrying a life that had already been far harder than most people knew. Before the Goonies, Matuszak had already lived one extreme life as a massive football star, a former #1 NFL draft pick, and a Super Bowl champion. He looked larger than life in every possible way, but that same image came with years of physical punishment, pain, and the kind of wear that fame and strength could not protect him from. After the movie, there was a sense that he might build an entirely new chapter in acting. Instead, his story ended tragically early. John Matusak died in 1989 at just 38 years old, and maybe that is what makes him so haunting to remember now. The man who played the most unexpectedly tender character in the Goonies never got the chance to grow old with the audience who loved him. 41 years later, the cast of the Goonies proves that time changed every one of them in very different ways. Some rose higher, some fell hard, and some quietly became almost unrecognizable from the kids' audiences once remembered. That is what makes their story so unforgettable. Which cast member shocked you the most after all these years? Leave your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned for more Then and Now. Stories about the stars' time changed the most.